All right, welcome to another deep dive. You guys know how this works, right? You send us sources, we go deep, and hopefully we all learn something new.
That's right.
This time, we're diving into a source called the Bodybuilding Truth. And I gotta say, right off the bat, this author is, well, let's just say he's not afraid to speak his mind.
Yeah, he's very direct.
He even says, like, his mission statement is to basically, call out what he sees as BS in the bodybuilding world.
Right.
And he warns us, the readers, well, and us now, I guess, that some of what he says might challenge, some of our deeply held beliefs about how to train.
He really cuts through a lot of the noise and gets right to the point.
Yeah. So what we're going to try to do in this deep dive, as always, is pull out the most valuable insights for you guys. That means everything from training principles, the role of genetics, which he talks about a lot, specific approaches for different muscle groups, debunking some myths, even taking a look back at the history of bodybuilding.
Absolutely. All with the goal of helping you guys become more informed and maybe even, rethink your own approach to fitness.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. One of the biggest things the author hammers on is the idea of a genetic cap, the idea that there's a limit to how much strength and muscle you can actually build.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not, like, sugarcoating it.
No, he's not. And that can be tough to hear, right? We
Yeah.
all want to believe that we can just keep pushing and pushing with no limits. But if you really think about it from a biological standpoint, it makes sense that our genes kind of set a framework for our potential.
Right. So it's not just about effort. It's not just about hard work. It's also about what you're starting with.
Precisely. And this ties into what he calls the balance between attitude and aptitude. Yeah, like your mindset and how much effort you put in, that's huge, obviously. But some people are just born with an advantage when it comes to athletic ability and muscle growth.
Right. And that leads us to a kind of tricky area. The author talks about ethnicity and athletic predisposition, which,
Yeah, a bit of a minefield, potentially.
yeah, he brings up some pretty direct examples, like the dominance of black athletes in sprinting. He even points to the top 20 times in the 100 meters back in 1994 and overall Olympic dominance in sprinting. And he goes so far as to suggest that maybe this could be linked to the history of slavery and the survival of, the strongest.
Right, and we need to be careful here because obviously this is a very sensitive topic, but we do want to present what the author says in the source material. And his theory basically is that because of the brutal conditions of slavery, only the strongest and most physically resilient individuals were likely to survive and, pass on their genes. So maybe that's why we see this, kind of overrepresentation of black athletes in those speed-dependent sports. But again, this is just the author's theory, not necessarily fact.
Exactly. It's important to just lay it out there as it is in the source material.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's up to the listener to, take that information and process it as they see fit.
Right. Okay, so then he contrasts this with the prevalence of white athletes in swimming. And he suggests maybe there are anatomical reasons for this. Like he talks about how black athletes tend to have shorter Achilles tendons, which are great for running, but maybe not so much for swimming.
Interesting point. And he also mentions body composition, suggesting that maybe the higher body fat percentage often seen in white individuals could actually help with buoyancy in the water.
Okay, makes sense. And he also mentions testosterone levels. He says that generally black individuals tend to have higher testosterone levels, followed by those of Italian and German or Austrian descent.
Right. So he's looking at various potential factors that might contribute to these patterns we observe in different sports.
Yeah, and he even brings up Dorian Yates, who was, this English bodybuilder who became this huge mass monster, which kind of goes against, any stereotypes about English athletic prowess. And then he talks about powerlifting as a sport that doesn't seem to follow those ethnic rules.
He mentions Tommy Kano, who was an Asian lifter, as an example of someone who achieved incredible things in powerlifting.
Exactly. So maybe it's not always so clear-cut.
Right. There are always exceptions.
And when it comes to boxing, he says it seems like success there is tied more to economic status than to ethnicity. He traces the lineage of heavyweight champs through different waves of, immigration and poverty. First it was the Irish, then the Italians, then black and Hispanic fighters.
Fascinating point, suggesting that in some sports, opportunity and just, sheer necessity might be bigger drivers of success than anything else.
Yeah. And then there's this whole idea of the hardgainer, which, some people say is a myth. But this author, he's pretty blunt. He says, no, it's not a myth. Some people just build muscle more easily than others.
He's basically saying, look, we're all dealt different genetic hands, and that's just reality.
Right. And he acknowledges that age and sex also play a role.
Of course. But he offers some encouragement, too. He talks about how Arnold Schwarzenegger was initially told he was too imbalanced to be successful, and then you have people like James Hockman, who had muscular dystrophy and became a champion high jumper.
Yeah, and he mentions Charles Boswell, a blind golfer, Sean Ray, who was quite short, Lee Labrada, who was small, and Frank Zane, who is known for being very thin.
All guys who, despite facing certain limitations, managed to achieve amazing things.
So his point is like, play the hand you're dealt, right?
Right. Strive to be the best you can be within your own genetic limits.
Okay, so let's move on to training principles. The author has this kind of cynical view of most training articles. He calls them like repetitive filler. Pick weight up, put weight down, repeat.
Right. He's not impressed with a lot of what's out there.
And he questions like the whole legitimacy of these secret programs and even the authority, a lot of strength coaches. He suggests that a lot of these coaches, they're successful because they're just naturally strong themselves, not because they have some like magical teaching ability.
Yeah, interesting perspective.
He also says, don't just blindly follow the routines of professional athletes.
Which is what a lot of people do, right?
Right, because a lot of their success comes down to, well, their genetics.
Exactly.
Okay, let's dive into some specifics about training different muscle groups, starting with the abs. The author, he's not a fan of, endless crunches and leg raises.
Yeah, a lot of people get obsessed with ab training.
Yeah, and he explains that the abs, they're mostly stabilizers. They don't have a huge range of motion, and a lot of times other muscles end up doing the work in those exercises.
He even says ab work is kind of unsatisfying, that you don't really get a good pump. The muscle group is pretty shallow, mostly slow twitch fibers, and a lot of it comes down to genetics anyway.
Right. You can't really change the shape of your abs too much.
But he does acknowledge the visual impact of well-defined abs. He uses Frank Zane as an example, a guy who, wasn't massive but had incredible abs that really enhanced his physique. And he does offer some practical advice. He suggests focusing on controlled movements, really visualizing the muscles working to make those ab exercises more effective.
Okay, so quality over quantity when it comes to abs.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about chest training.
Okay, chest.
He says the chest often responds quickly to training because of those type 2 muscle fibers, the fast twitch ones, and those fibers aren't used a lot in everyday life, so they're primed for growth.
Yeah, makes sense.
But he warns about, developing an imbalance from doing too much bench press, which can lead to narrow, low pecs. He emphasizes the need for both compound and isolation movements to build a square, wide, high, and tight chest.
And he gives a sample 20-minute chest workout.
Yeah, it's a good one. It starts with dumbbell flies as a warm-up and pre-exhaust.
Mm-hmm.
Then you move to parallel bar dips, which he considers the best compound exercise for chest.
Okay, dips over bench press. Interesting.
He includes bench press, but with a caution not to rely on it too much. Then incline dumbbell presses to target the upper pecs. And then he finishes with cable crossovers to really isolate that inner chest.
So it's a pretty comprehensive routine, even though it's relatively short.
Exactly. It covers all the bases. Now let's move on to a muscle group that a lot of people struggle with, calves.
Oh, calves.
He admits that his own calves aren't exactly, world class. And he says, look, a lot of it comes down to genetics. Calf size and shape are largely determined by what you're born with.
Which can be frustrating.
It can be, yeah. He shares his own struggles and how he eventually found a method that worked for him after, years of trying different things. And he basically says, forget the usual advice of high reps versus low reps. They both have their flaws.
So what's his method?
It's pretty intense. Pick one exercise. He prefers seated calf raises. Then you aim for 75 to 100 total reps. But you use a weight that you could normally only do about 20 reps with, and you just keep going to failure set after set with minimal rest, like under 10 seconds until you hit that target rep count.
Sounds brutal.
It is. He warns you about the pain.
All right, well, a word of caution there.
Yeah. Next up, biceps.
Okay, the glamour muscle.
He talks about the importance of finding the angle that really isolates the biceps the best, and he has this interesting concept of doing the opposite.
Doing the opposite. What does he mean by that?
So he points out that, a lot of people do exercises like hammer curls and easy bar curls where the brachialis muscle, which is underneath the biceps, gets heavily involved. So his idea is to do the opposite, to use a straight wrist position to put more direct stress on the biceps themselves.
Okay.
And he even has a specific cable curl exercise he describes with very precise instructions on how to keep your elbows in, your back straight, wrists level, and really focus on that peak contraction.
So it's all about, like, really targeting the muscle.
Exactly. No wasted movement.
Okay, what about traps?
Ah, traps. He loves traps. He calls them a big, powerful muscle group that really shows strength. And he says they're built through weightlifting, not just from playing sports.
Yeah, you got to hit the iron.
He mentions that the range of motion in a lot of trap exercises is limited, and he points out that if your traps get too big compared to your shoulders, you can end up looking a bit imbalanced. But he stresses how important strong traps are for overall upper body strength.
Makes sense.
And he gives a couple of example exercises. Heavy barbell cleans, which use momentum, and then seated rows, but with your elbows high and back to really hit the upper lats and traps with that specific arm angle.
Good stuff.
All right, next up, quads.
Leg day.
He emphasizes the intensity needed for leg training.
Nobody likes leg day.
They're tough, but he says, look, your legs can handle a lot of stress. And when you train legs hard, it has a systemic impact on your whole body.
Yeah, it definitely takes it out of you.
He gives a 10-step guide to building great quads. 1.5 squats, leg extensions as an addition, partial reps for overload, 20 rep squats, which he says can help with growth hormone release.
Breathing squats, right?
Yeah, those are the ones. And he suggests trying different squat stances to hit different areas of the quads.
Always good to mix it up.
And of course, he emphasizes the importance of just training hard and consistently.
No shortcuts.
All right, moving on to deltoids. The shoulders.
Shoulders, gotta love those shoulders.
He talks about how crucial they are for that classic V-taper, and he says they're often either neglected or overtrained.
Yeah, I can see that.
Because, the deltoids are involved in almost all upper body exercises.
Right, especially the front delts.
Exactly. And he lays out a specialized routine that includes a superset warm-up with light-seated dumbbell presses, static lateral raises where you hold the weight, W presses, mini presses behind the neck, and then leaning cable contractions to really hit the side delt from a different angle.
So he's really focusing on hitting all three heads of the delt.
Absolutely. And he suggests training triceps after you've done chest or shoulders, as a way to warm them up. Then he gives a routine that hits all 3 tricep heads. Standing tricep press downs with a close grip, seated overhead dumbbell extensions to target the lower part of the tricep, kneeling rope pulls, and of course, skull crushers.
Classic tricep exercise.
Yeah, for a reason. They work. And finally, we have the back.
Back the foundation.
He's very critical of relying too much on machines and cables for back training.
Really?
Yeah. He's a big believer in barbell rows. He says the back works as a unit, and using those braced movements might isolate your lats, but at the expense of overall back development. He
Interesting.
really emphasizes visualizing the muscles working during those rows, and he even recommends making barbell rows your only back exercise for an entire month.
Wow, that's hardcore. All right, let's move on to some of those common misconceptions in bodybuilding. He calls them common conceptions.
Myth-busting time.
First one, doing aerobics on an empty stomach maximizes fat loss. What he explains is that even if you haven't eaten, your body still has some carbohydrate stores. And if you do too much cardio in that fasted state, your body can actually start breaking down muscle tissue for fuel.
Which is exactly what you don't want if you're trying to build or maintain muscle.
Exactly. Second myth.
Yeah.
You should wear a weight belt all the time to prevent injuries.
He says, nope, there's no real scientific evidence to support that.
Interesting.
The key is good lifting technique. Using a belt too much can actually weaken your core over time.
Okay, that makes sense. Myth number 3. Rest is just as good as sleep.
He strongly disagrees with that. He says deep sleep is crucial for recovery.
Yeah, you got to get those Z's.
He says it's when your body really repairs and rebuilds tissue, including muscle growth.
Next one. Time-released nutrients are better absorbed by your body.
He calls that a myth, too. He says our digestive system is pretty efficient at breaking down and absorbing nutrients.
Okay. And he also talks about constipation, which is not a very glamorous topic, but he says that proper elimination of waste is important for making sure you have a constant flow of fresh nutrients coming in.
Makes sense. You got to keep things moving, right?
Right. Myth number 5. You need a high glycemic carb drink immediately after your workout. He says protein is actually more important right after training.
And he also says that the whole thing about, precise nutrient timing is a bit overrated.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Unless you're fasting or something, your body usually has nutrients in your bloodstream even after you finish training.
Right. 6th myth. You don't need supplements if you're eating regular food.
He pushes back on that a bit. He says supplements can help optimize your body's anabolic state and recovery, especially if you're not getting all the nutrients you need from food alone.
So supplements can be helpful, but they're not essential.
Exactly. They're supplemental, like the name suggests.
All right, myth number 7. You can target specific areas of your body to lose fat through exercise. Spot reduction.
He says flat out, not possible. Fat loss happens systemically throughout the body.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Myth number 8. If you do endless ab work, you'll get visible abs.
He says it's mostly diet and genetics.
Exactly. Some people just naturally have abs that show more easily, even at a higher body fat percentage.
Lucky them.
Yeah. And the last myth, you should never do 1-rep maxes.
Yeah, those are pretty risky.
He says they increase the risk of injury, and they're not really necessary for building muscle.
All right, good to know. So the author has this section called A New Angle on Things. It's all about exercise variations.
Yeah.
He has this idea of like thinking inside out to come up with new and different ways to use gym machines.
Yeah, he gets really creative here.
He gives all these examples, like using the pec deck to work your rear delts by facing the machine, doing standing pec deck contractions by leaning back.
I've never tried that one.
One-arm pec deck flies, leaning into the movement, using the lat pull-down machine for straight arm pull-downs, triceps extensions, even ab crunches by facing away from the machine. He even suggests using the Smith machine for toe raises.
Interesting.
One-arm rows, using cables for lying curls to prevent cheating, and repurposing, like the lat pull-down or ab board for reverse hamstring curls.
Wow, that's a lot of ideas.
He also talks about using the leg extension for sissy squats, the hamstring curl machine for seated calf raises, even the pads from a calf machine for shoulder shrugs. So basically he's saying, don't be afraid to experiment and find what works for you.
Think outside the box, or in this case, inside the machine.
Now there's this ongoing debate about high intensity versus high volume training. He kind of challenges the simple comparison of like sprinters being muscular and long distance runners being thin as proof that intensity is always better.
He points out that genetics plays a huge role, and also, if you think about it, even in a short sprint, there's still a significant amount of total work being done by the muscles, especially if you consider the number of steps involved.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, we need to address this next section carefully. He calls it steroids for health, a reworking. The author acknowledges his past as, well, let's just say someone who knows a thing or two about drugs, and the very controversial nature of steroid use.
Right. This is definitely sensitive territory.
He's very clear that this is for informational purposes only, not an endorsement. He even talks about how he's seen some guys, real extremists, die young and suggests that their drug use might have played a role. He says there were very divided opinions on steroids.
Yeah, some people are completely against them. Some people think they're fine if used responsibly.
Right. And he makes the point that side effects are mostly related to the dosage and duration of use, which can lead people to underestimate the risks. He also emphasizes that no drug is completely safe, and steroids can be very easily abused. He even compares it to alcohol, saying, you can drink responsibly, or you can drink yourself to death.
Right. It's about making informed choices.
And then he lays out these 7 rules for responsible steroid use.
According to him, that is.
Right. So first, he says you got to know the specific drugs.
Do your research.
Second rule, exhaust all natural training methods first. He says you should train naturally for at least 5 years and be over 24 years old before even considering steroids.
So build a solid foundation first.
Third, get a full medical checkup before and after any cycles, blood work and all that.
Make sure you're healthy enough to handle it.
Fourth, keep cycles short, a maximum of 3 weeks.
Minimize the potential for long-term side effects.
Fifth, use low dosages.
Again, less is more.
Sixth, avoid high-risk substances. He actually lists some specific examples here and talks about some milder alternatives, but even those have downsides. And finally, his 7th rule. If you get to the point where 1,000 milligrams per week no longer produces gains, stop. He says that's a sign you might be developing a dependency.
So he's basically saying listen to your body and know when to stop.
And again, we want to be very clear that this information is just what's presented in the source material. We're not endorsing any of it.
It's up to each individual to make their own decisions.
Right. Let's move on to something a little less controversial.
Yeah.
He has a section called Odd and Forgotten Exercise Techniques. He says a lot of good exercises from the past have been, kind of forgotten, partly because of modern machines and partly because people are so focused on achieving a specific, sometimes even freaky kind of muscularity.
Yeah, he's a big fan of some of those old school methods.
He gives examples like barbell lockout holds, where you just hold the barbell against the supports in a power rack.
Yeah, those are great for building strength at a specific point in the range of motion.
Then there's the swing bell, which is swinging a light dumbbell overhead in a circle.
That one's good for flexibility, especially in the lower back.
Barbell hacks, which is an older variation of hack squats.
Those are great for quads.
And spring chest expanders, which you can use for triceps, deltoids, and lats.
Those things are surprisingly versatile.
All right, next he gives a little history lesson, the roots of bodybuilding.
A trip down memory lane.
He talks about how Joe Weider really started pushing bodybuilding with his Your Physique magazine, the rivalry between Weider and Bob Hoffman, and the unexpected popularity of Muscle Beach in Santa Monica.
That was the golden era, right?
Yeah, and then you had these hardcore bodybuilders emerge who were taking a more analytical approach to training.
Guys like Vince Gironda, he was really innovative with his training and nutrition methods.
And then you have Rio Blair, who was a pioneer in developing modern protein supplements.
He was ahead of his time.
Then there was a kind of decline in bodybuilding. And then it had this huge resurgence with the movie Pumping Iron and, of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Arnold really brought bodybuilding to the mainstream.
And, of course, the introduction of Dianabol, the steroid, had a big impact.
Yeah, that changed things.
The author emphasizes that today's bodybuilders are part of a long, evolving history. And he lists a whole bunch of key figures, from Charles Atlas and Professor Attila way back in the day to, Larry Scott and Arnold.
A lot of pioneers and innovators.
He really highlights what each of them contributed to the sport. And it's fascinating to see how some of these ideas keep coming back around.
Right. What's old is new again.
Okay, next up, Wisdom of the Ages. This is where he shares all these insightful quotes about training philosophy and dedication from people like Vince Gironda, Sig Klein, Bradley Steiner, Dave Draper, Don Peters, even Socrates, and of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
A lot of great wisdom there. It's amazing how some of these quotes, they were written decades ago, but they're still relevant today.
Now we get to the aerobics issue. And the author does not hold back here. He's basically saying that traditional aerobics are pretty useless for fat loss and improving your physique.
He's definitely not a fan of cardio.
He critiques the whole idea of training in a specific target heart rate zone, and he explains how the body adapts to that kind of consistent, low-level movement so you stop seeing results. He also says that during those long aerobic sessions, your body actually burns more protein and carbs before it really starts burning fat.
He even calls it catabolic, meaning it can lead to muscle loss.
Yeah, and he uses the example of a marathon runner to illustrate this. These runners are expending huge amounts of energy, but they're not necessarily losing a lot of fat, and they might even be breaking down muscle. He also talks about how high-impact aerobics can be damaging to your joints, and that the heavy breathing can increase free radical damage and even increase your intake of pollutants.
He makes some good points.
And he says, aerobics aren't even necessary for cardiovascular health. He says weight training works your heart just fine, and it doesn't really increase your lifespan or flexibility all that much. And ultimately, he says, it's not very effective for fat loss. He says the key to losing fat is eating less.
Which is true, you can't outrun a bad diet.
But he does offer an alternative. He calls it a no aerobics aerobic workout.
Yeah, kind of a contradiction in terms.
Right. But what he means is you use weight training techniques, but you keep the rest periods very short, like under a minute. And you incorporate unilateral exercises, using one leg or one arm at a time. This elevates your heart rate and keeps the intensity high, but it also spares your muscle and can even promote muscle growth. He also suggests doing supersets with short rest periods as another effective approach. And he challenges listeners to try eliminating traditional aerobics for a month and see what happens.
It's an interesting experiment.
All right, next up, ketogenic diet, the truth.
He's not a fan of the keto diet either. He says it's not really a good fat loss strategy.
Another myth busted.
He explains the whole premise of cutting out carbs to force the body into ketosis and burn fat. But he says, that's pretty obvious.
Calories in, calories out.
Right. And he points out how hard it is to actually stick to a keto diet long term, the limited food choices, the potential for constipation, the low energy, how it can make your muscles look flat, and even the risk of muscle loss.
Yeah, it can be pretty restrictive.
He even mentions the physique of one of the main proponents of the keto diet and, kind of implies that if it were really that effective, this guy would be a lot leaner. And he suggests that a lot of the anecdotal success stories you hear about, they either involve people using fat-burning drugs or they're misinterpreting what low-carb eating really means.
Yeah, a lot of people think they're eating low carb, but they're really not.
And ultimately, he reiterates that, look, the fundamental principle for fat loss is burning more calories than you consume. It's not rocket science.
Simple, but not easy.
Okay, last section. Nutrition nuggets.
Hmm.
He starts by saying that when it comes to protein, a gram of protein is pretty much a gram of protein.
Regardless of the source.
He does caution about the purity of cheaper protein sources like whey concentrate.
Yeah, you get what you pay for.
And for gaining bulk, he says the surefire method is simply to eat more.
Calories are king.
But he emphasizes healthy foods, of course. And he suggests a more sustainable approach to dieting by focusing on incorporating, like, good-tasting, bodybuilding-friendly foods rather than just strict deprivation.
He's a big believer in enjoying your food.
And he provides a list of 20 fabulous foods for muscle growth and fat loss.
Everything from water and oatmeal to chicken, fish, and berries.
Yeah, a really good mix. And he also gives some great tasting ideas for using protein powder in shakes and even desserts.
Protein pumpkin pie, protein oatmeal cookies.
Sounds good to me.
Now, we wrap up with the wisdom of the old-timers revisited. The author really contrasts the, sometimes freaky drug-influenced physiques of today with the more natural physiques of the past.
The golden era.
Yeah, back when guys were building their bodies without all the, pharmaceutical help. And a lot of those guys, they started out small, so they really had to be smart about their training.
They had to work with what they had.
Exactly. And he emphasizes the importance of developing your own instincts and intuition when it comes to training.
So don't just blindly follow someone else's program.
Right. He even shares some of those old school tricks, like Vince Gironda's trick for gaining 5 to 10 pounds in a week.
Oh, what's that one?
Basically, you increase your water intake significantly and take desiccated liver tablets.
Okay.
Interesting.
He also talks about the benefits of sweat belts, not just for back support, but for keeping the lower back warm and promoting water loss.
Old school.
He even suggests combining them with Vaseline and yohimbe for enhanced definition.
Wow.
He also talks about the importance of getting outside, fresh air, sunshine, vitamin D, all that good stuff.
Can't argue with that.
He emphasizes the old school wisdom of avoiding starchy carbs if you're trying to lose fat. And he shares Charles Atlas's tip for ending your showers with cold water on your solar plexus and genitals to stimulate the nervous system and boost testosterone.
All right, that's a new one.
And he revisits that old guideline of 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. He says it's been somewhat vindicated as a reasonable starting point for keeping fat and carbs in check.
So there's something to be said for those old school rules.
Definitely. And finally, he mentions the old-timer belief that your body can only really use about 25 grams of protein per meal.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
He uses the analogy of showering your muscles with protein too much, and it just goes down the drain.